Promising to be the greatest jobs producer and finally accepting US intelligence assessments that Russia meddled in the election. But Donald Trump's first news conference as president-elect also highlighted a tangle of potential problems and conflicts of interest. This is Inside Story. Hello and a warm welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Donald Trump knows how to make headlines, often through the 140 characters of a tweet. So it's no surprise that his first media conference as US president-elect generated some noise. He says he's already working on creating jobs, replacing Obamacare health insurance and appointing a new Supreme Court judge. But reporters repeatedly returned to questions about Russia. After weeks of denials, Trump, for the first time, accepted that Russian hackers tried to influence the presidential election. But he rejected allegations of a Russian campaign to blackmail him. Trump says he can have a strong relationship with the Russians.
If Putin likes Donald Trump, guess what, folks? That's called an asset, not a liability. Now, I don't know that I'm going to get along with Vladimir Putin. I hope I do, but there's a good chance I won't. And if I don't, do you honestly believe that Hillary would be tougher on Putin than me? Does anybody in this room really believe that? Give me a break.
Let's bring in our panel now for our discussion. In Washington, D.C., we have Jack Kingston, a former Republican congressman who was a senior advisor to Donald Trump during the presidential campaign. In London, Inderjeet Palmer, a professor in international politics at City University of London. And also in Washington, Raisa Schoenberg, who is a former director of international economic affairs at the National Security Council at the White House. That's a post she's just left. Welcome, all of you. Great to have you here on Inside Story. First, I want to get your views on Trump's performance at his first press conference as president-elect. Jack, how did you rate it?
I think he did a great job. I think he outlined a bold agenda. He took on the issue of Obamacare, replacing and repealing it. He announced that he was going to have a Supreme Court nominee next week. He talked about the new VA head, Dr. David Skulkin. So he covered a lot of territory. Unfortunately, as usual, there's going to be a little bit of a food fight, and that's what the press tends to focus on. But the reality is he showed who was in control, and it was Donald Trump.
Raisa, would you agree with that? Did Donald Trump show that he was in control of the situation?
Well, I actually would frame it a little bit differently. I would agree that he absolutely covered a lot of ground and made a few important announcements, but I think he also underscored for everyone that he would like things to go according to his own plans and his own rules. And I think the fact that he is continuing to take on the press in such personal ways is really, really troubling, and I think is worth focusing on.
Jack, he was combative, wasn't he? Especially with BuzzFeed and then especially with CNN.
Well, I think he had the right to be. The BuzzFeed story, which even by their own disclaimer is specious at best, it's an allegation, it's a proposal. There's nothing that backs it. I think to make a big deal about it, really, it would have never happened to President Obama. It would have never happened had Hillary Clinton been the nominee. And I'm not saying that the press isn't tough on other candidates, but I think the press is unusually tough on Donald Trump and dying to delegitimize his election. First it was the popular votes, then it was we've got to have a recount, and getting behind fringe candidates like Jill Stein saying that there was, we have to have this recount and so forth. So to me, and then it was the Russian hacking. And even though there is a wide acceptance about Russia hacking and trying to interfere with the election, there's also wide acceptance that it made no difference in the results of the election. But yes, Donald Trump is not afraid to take on the press, and he kind of knows that the press isn't going to be his ally, and that's why he keeps his own Twitter account so that he can directly communicate with the American people. The exchange with CNN, I do think that you have to respect the President of the United States, and while you might get frustrated that you're not called upon, or somehow you believe you have the right to ask a question or that your question has to be asked, you don't necessarily have that right. You're at the press conference as a guest of the president, and they can control who they call on. And President Obama, President Bush did that. President Clinton did that. This is just what presidents do. But to be yelling at a president is somewhat disrespectful at minimum.
Inderjeet, do you agree with Jack's key point there that Donald Trump has the right to be combative if he sees the press being unusually tough on him? I mean, would some not say that that is not the press's job, to be tough on their leader-elect?
Well, he has the right to respond the way he did, and the media has the right to make inquiries. The role of the media in a democratic society actually is to hold to account those who have great power. And there isn't really a greater power than the president at the moment. So I think they have the right. But in terms of disrespect, I think you could probably look at the history of the last, 12, 15 months and see a great deal of disrespect. And the whole kind of, the tone of civil discourse has diminished. And I think President-elect Trump has played his role in that.
Raisa, what's your point on that? Do you think both sides have a role to play with a press conference such as we saw yesterday, descending into sort of trading of barbs and being somewhat more disrespectful than we might expect from a presidential press conference?
I actually find something else a little bit more distressing, which is that the president-elect is so very, very focused on exactly the tone and tenor of the coverage in the news. I think that the more important thing is how is he going to be able to deal with, when he's actually in office, a vast number of issues and crises that come to pass, and not having to focus on day-to-day how the press covers him. I don't think there's going to be an opportunity for the president-elect to daily take to task certain publications that he's just not happy with. I really genuinely find it troubling that the president-elect is spending so much time criticizing openly and publicly those that he does not agree with and does not like.
Well, let's take that point. Let's look at some of the issues that are going to be facing him, taking up some of his time. Jack, let's look at Russia, as we mentioned there in the introduction. Are you surprised to see Trump finally accepting that Russia did hack or may have a hacking attempt at meddling in the election?
Not at all. I think after he has had time to formally be briefed, then he got the information that he was looking for. What I think part of his outrage was that somebody within the intelligence community was apparently talking to the press and not talking to him. And keep in mind that the CIA director said that they would not have time to brief Congress on this. Chairman Devin Nunes of the House Intelligence Committee wanted to be briefed on this in mid-December, and the same intelligence community that was apparently talking to the press said they did not have time to report to the members of Congress about it. So I think there has been some games that have been played in the intelligence community, but once Donald Trump got the information in a formal briefing, I think he was in a position to accept it. But again, it was widely stated and accepted that whatever interference Russia had in the election did not affect the outcome. And I think that's an important point, which is often not emphasized in popular discussion, you might say.
It has it not, though, Jack, forced him to pull back slightly from his relationship with Putin?
Yes, and I think there's a needle that's going to be threaded here, because you have to be tough on Putin. And I think if you listen to Tillerson's testimony yesterday, he said that he would have helped arm, as I understood it, this is how he said it, that he would have helped arm the Ukrainian people at the border. And it's interesting that the same senators who are criticizing Trump for being too cozy to Putin, they were not the ones saying, hey, let's arm the Ukrainians and let them defend themselves. But here, Tillerson was saying yesterday that you should. So I think that, we've always had a little bit of a two-step when it comes to Russia, and that is you have to be tough. On the same hand, you want to cooperate because it's in the interest of both countries and indeed the world for the two big, powerful nations to cooperate. And I don't mean only two, but I mean certainly they need to cooperate.
Raisa, were you surprised to hear Rex Tillerson, who of course is Donald Trump's Secretary of State nominee, were you surprised to hear him say that the US and Russia are unlikely to be close friends? It does seem to be quite a turnaround, doesn't it?
I was, in fact. I was also surprised during the questioning by Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, that Rex Tillerson actually came out and said, well, I actually haven't had an opportunity to discuss Russia with the president-elect. And in the course of the testimony, not only did he talk about arming Ukrainians, but he also seemed to walk back a little bit from whether or not sanctions would be lifted under a new Trump administration. It also seemed to me that the president-elect, in the course of the press conference, was sort of giving himself a little bit of space. So talking about the closeness of his relationship with Putin and how they would get along, but then saying, well, perhaps if we don't, I will inevitably be much tougher than my Democratic opponent during the actual elections process. So I actually think that the Trump administration is going to take some time to sort out the situation, and a lot of the sort of bluster that we heard in the course of the election process, and even now since the election, I think that we're going to find it's not going to come to pass nearly as quickly as the Russians might anticipate and hope.
Inderjeet, would you agree with that? Do you think that Trump is going to be tougher, as he says, than Clinton would have been?
Well, I think Donald Trump's whole hallmark is America first. And he claims to stand for the American people. He's going to put them first. And I think he also sees himself as a deal maker, somebody who wins. And I think in his relations with Russia and any other power, I think the first thing we have to see is that I think he's got a fairly clear idea about American interests. And I think he tries to negotiate a better position. So when he rows back on Russia and the various claims being made, or he does something else, or Tillerson makes another statement which seems to suggest a changed position, I think what you're looking at here is that this is a message not only to those who are asking the question, but also those in Russia and elsewhere who are watching, that you cannot take for granted that Donald Trump is going to be your best friend, that this government is going to negotiate the very best position possible as they see it, and they're going to play hardball with it. So I don't see that there was anything very surprising when you're at a press conference and you're being pressed, or when you're in a Senate confirmation hearing and you're being put under pressure, for Tillerson and Trump respectively to do and say what they did say. I expect them to effectively lay out a stall which suggests we can go in a number of different directions. And in a way, it's up to you whether you want to accept the kind of hard power or something less than that.
Jack, you were senior advisor to Trump during the presidential campaign. You also went to Russia in December. What was the purpose of your trip?
Well, I work with an international law firm, Squire Patton Boggs, and we have offices all over the globe, 4 in the Middle East, 4 in the UK, for example. We're in Europe, and we're also in Moscow. And so before the election and after the election, we did a number of election summaries. We did them in Brussels, we did them in the UK, we did them in Australia, we did them in Washington, and did them in Moscow. And so I talked to the U.S. Chamber there about the election, just as I would any other place. Now, unfortunately, I think there was this incorrect assumption that I was wearing a Trump hat on the side. I was not. While I was over there, the question of sanctions did come up, and because we have American businesses who haven't just been there in the last 10 years, but many of them, for example, Caterpillar Tractor Company has been there since the 1930s, and they're finding that the sanctions are difficult on them. There was also a commission that was the Russian-American relations, and I can't remember the exact term of it, that President Obama set up, and it was actually a good conduit for communication and information. And unfortunately, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, it was dissolved. There was some talk about maybe restarting that as a positive, constructive type thing. But I was not wearing my Trump hat at all, but I am very interested in Russia, and I'm interested in the relationship.
Do you think that Trump should lift the sanctions?
I think it's a tool on the table. I think that it's something that you say, we can be tougher on these sanctions, but if you look at them, what have they brought out in terms of results? And they have not delivered the intended results. So I think at this point he can say, listen, we can double down on these sanctions, or maybe if we get some cooperation in our battle against ISIS, if we have some clear understanding about this hacking situation, if you guys can help do something maybe to check Assad in Syria, we're interested in it. But keep in mind, one of the things in international policy, just like with Nixon and Kissinger, when they got friendlier with China, they put Russia at a disadvantage. In this case, sending a signal to China through more cooperation potentially with Russia could be a good thing. And I am not suggesting, because I don't know, but that may be something that Trump and Tillerson are considering. The choice between Russia and China, which way do you go? And not necessarily playing one off the other, but letting both nations know, hey, we've got options here.
Okay, let's move on and look at Trump's business interests. That also took up a substantial amount of time of this press conference. Trump announced he'll be distancing himself from his global real estate business, but there are still concerns that the company could create conflicts of interest. Now, the president-elect has business ties to a developer in the Philippines, for example, who was recently named the country's special envoy to the United States. Trump's company has more projects in India than in any other location outside of North America. Many of the partners there have political ties to India's ruling party. And Turkey ended calls for the removal of Trump's name from Trump Towers in Istanbul after he suggested that President Erdogan had the right to impose a crackdown after the failed coup. Raisa, he did spend a substantial amount of time, as I just said, dealing with his business interests and outlining how he was going to avoid conflicts of interest. Are you satisfied with the way he dealt with that, saying that he was going to sign them off to his sons? And does that release him? Does that avoid any potential conflict of interest?
I'm actually quite troubled by what I heard yesterday from the president-elect. I just don't understand how one creates a barrier between himself and his business interests by signing them away to his children. I think that, in fact, underscores the fact that the president-elect will indeed continue to have involvement in his business interests. I think as experts on the subject, and I'm not one of them, but as I've heard experts on the subject speak to this, the only thing really that will, in fact, be satisfactory is for the president-elect to divest himself. I think there's a secondary level of concern, not just about the ethics that are in question here, but also, in fact, national security issues. I would agree with those who have talked about the fact that, you know, having the Trump name around the world in places that have seen some terrorism, for instance, in Istanbul, as you've said, also in Mumbai, does that perhaps create a sitting duck situation where, you know, our own national security will be in question because these buildings become greater targets and much more appealing targets for those willing to do harm to the United States interests?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point, isn't it? When you've got so many interests around the globe, I believe it's more than 500 companies in around 24 countries. I mean, is it possible, Inderjeet, to avoid a conflict of interest scandal?
Well, you could minimize the chances, I guess, if you were to distance yourself from the companies in question. But the problem is that the Trump name and Trump business interests are very large. But even if he were to build a sort of Chinese wall, if you like, between himself and his business interests, the fact remains that he is a business candidate. If you look at his appointments, look at the landing teams, look at where they come from, the Defense Department landing team, for example, there are lots of people from big arms manufacturers, the State Department team, some very large international firms who have been studying all aspects of America's global relations. So even if Donald Trump were to divest his interests, the fact remains that he is appointed to his administration, which is a bit surprising given the populist character of his claims, that he was against the establishment, against big corporations and the low taxes they pay, and so on, that he's actually appointed a cabinet of billionaires and of very big business people. So he can do whatever he likes in regard to his relationship with those companies. The fact remains that his administration is packed full of people who basically know their business interests and the business interests of the broader American community as well.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it, Jack, that Inderjeet raises when we see people like Trump, people like Tillerson, other billionaires in his cabinet, and we look at the foreign policy. Is the foreign policy going to be chiefly to advance economic interests of America over political interests, as we've seen in other presidencies?
No, I don't think so. He talked a lot about rebuilding the military and peace through strength, and not equivocating when it comes time to deal with terrorists. For example, one of the things he challenged Hillary Clinton on is using the term radical Islamic jihadist. His view was you need to label who the enemy is, narrow that scope so you can say, look, there's good guys and bad guys out there, but there's some who are causing a problem. But also things like taking on the red lines in Syria, or leaving Iraq without a statement of forces. And so what he wants is more clarity, I think, when dealing with our adversaries out there, but stronger relationships with again, who will work with us. And, getting back to Russia just for a minute, he said many times, listen, if we can work with Russia to defeat ISIS, is this not in everyone's interest? And in fact, Secretary of State Kerry has been attempting to do that as well. So I think you are gonna see economic interest, but rather than say let's expand trade agreements, he's actually saying let's renegotiate trade agreements to make sure they're in the interest of the American businesses and the American companies. And so it's different. He is a populist, and he was elected on change. And I think just like with Brexit, or maybe with the Italian referendum recently, he is listening to a voice of the people that's saying we want to shake things up. And so when it comes to foreign policy, I think you will see differences.
So, Raisa, when we've got this focus, as Jack was just saying, on American protectionism, of more jobs being created in the US, where does it leave the US on the global stage in terms of it being, in the past, and being a leading promoter of the global economy, of open markets, of the rule of law? Does it still have that standing if it turns so inward?
Well, I think that it leaves us with a little bit of uncertainty is actually how I would characterize it. As we discussed earlier today, it's not really clear which direction the new administration is going to take on a whole host of issues. I think when the Trump team says that they're going to renegotiate trade agreements, that leaves a really big question mark, because just as we might be interested in negotiating a better agreement for ourselves, I think our partners will also take the opportunity to extract greater concessions from the United States. I think this is a big give and take. So does it leave the United States weaker on the global stage? I think it leaves just a big, big question mark. And I think that inherently undermines our position in some ways. I will say that maybe there is a little bit of an advantage in keeping folks on their toes, for instance. But I do think that part of what the United States leadership is based around is consistency and stability in policymaking. And that's really what economic policy responds to and markets responds to, is predictability and a level of stability. And we just don't have that at the moment from the Trump administration. I will just come back to and maybe use this as an example for a moment to what the congressman said with respect to Russia and to making deals with the Russians and trying to work with ISIS, and perhaps using that as a lever, using sanctions as a lever to get better cooperation on Syria. I find it just generally troubling that we're kind of putting everything on the table, including our allies, by saying that we're willing to lift sanctions that were imposed for Russian action in Ukraine in order to get better cooperation from the Russians on maybe other issues. I think it leaves our allies high and dry, and I think that's exactly the kind of uncertainty that a lot of our allies are looking at from Southeast Asia through Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well. That's really troubling for us.
Indrajit, do you agree with that? Do you agree that this incoming administration brings with it much uncertainty? And do you see that uncertainty continuing throughout the next 4 years?
Well, I think there is a degree of uncertainty, but on the other hand, the markets and Wall Street, who were his enemies, if you like, beforehand, have very much welcomed him to the presidency, and the markets have been doing particularly well. So I think Wall Street loves him. He's appointed many people from Goldman Sachs and elsewhere to his administration. So I don't think there's necessarily that much uncertainty in that regard. I think the uncertainty, to some extent, we have to wait and see.
Okay.
But I think it's going to be more selective,
with that,
perhaps.
you do bring us to the end of our discussion. It's going to be a very interesting few years. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what happens in the coming weeks, months, years ahead. Thank you all very much for joining us today to give us some insight as to what we think to expect from the Trump administration. Jack Kingston, Indrajit Palmer and Raisa Schoenberg. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.